In today's note, we're going to be looking at collecting data. So before we get into collecting data, let's take a look at some review of types of data and sampling techniques. So if a researcher collected data on the number of music albums sold, and they found that there were 300 alternative, 150 rock, 125 hip hop, 50 reggae, and 10 rap, I want to know, am I looking at one variable or two variable data? And I need to identify the variables or variable. So if I am looking at this, I'm looking at the number of music albums sold. And I am looking at that in terms of a frequency. So I'm just counting the numbers of each type sold. So this would be considered one variable data because I'm looking at just the music type. The frequency doesn't count as a variable because that's just what I'm adding up or how many I have of each variable. So it's a one variable data and I'm looking at music type. If I want to classify the data or the variable that I'm looking at and try to select an appropriate method to display it. Well, because I'm not dealing with any numerical data, right? I'm not dealing with any numbers. That would mean that my data is categorical because it's categories, types of music, and because there is no rank or order to it, that means it would be nominal categorical data. And if we're trying to select an appropriate method to display this, because we are dealing with numeric or categorical data, that means we should be dealing with a bar graph. So if we reveal here, we've seen this graph previously, but it is a bar graph. So that means we should be dealing with a bar graph to display it. Second question. If a record company is interested in the music preferences of Canadian teens and they survey 500 secondary students from the DSBN, we want to be able to identify the population and the sample. So remember, the population is all the individuals that we're studying. So in this case, all the individuals that we're studying are Canadian teens. That's our population. Our sample is the subset of this group. So the group of Canadian teens that we were looking at specifically and gathering data on are DSBN students. Because that is the group that we're looking at. And suggest two sampling techniques that the company could use. Well, there's lots of options here. We have about 7 of them. Right, we had our simple random sample. So this would be where we could take or use the student ID numbers or use student IDs in a random number generator, kind of similar to putting names into a hat and selecting it. Systematic sampling, we could select every, say, 10th student from an alphabetical list. We could do a cluster survey where we split all the students up into schools and we only select schools. So survey certain schools. So we'd be surveying everyone in those schools. stratified sampling. So this is where we are breaking them up into groups and then selecting a certain proportion. So we could be breaking them up into schools and then say selecting grade 12s. Or you could say you're selecting maybe 25% from each school. Voluntary, so voluntary website. You could have maybe a Google form on the DSBN website, and whoever goes to it would answer it or complete the survey. And you could have a convenience sample. So this would be easiest. So if it was easiest for them, you may ask teenagers that go into a record store, because you know they'll be listening to music. Or you can just go to a school event and just ask students there, or ask teenagers, just something easy. So that was a review of what we've looked at, but now looking at our new stuff, our new terms, we're going to look at two types of studies. So one type of study would be observational studies, and this is where researchers record behaviors and draw inferences. So where they're actually just it's in the term observation, so they're making observations and making inferences from those observations. In experimental studies, the researcher tries to determine cause and effect relationships between two variables by controlling one and comparing the others to a control group. So it seems self-explanatory because it is in the terminology. Experimental, you are actually doing an experiment to try to determine if there is a cause and effect between whatever you are looking at. Observational would just be observing what happens and just drawing inferences from that. So you're not really controlling much, you're just observing what happens. So to kind of compare the two, if we were to look at two examples, the first example, a researcher interviews people as they leave the gym and finds that they get fewer colds compared to people who do not go to the gym. So we want to determine what type of study this is and then change it to see to the other type of study. So if we were looking at this would be observational. Right? Because we're not controlling anything, there's no controls. The researcher is just observing people and making inferences from them. If we wanted to change this, we would have to create a control group to make this experimental. So we would have a control group of people who don't go to the gym. Right. So we would need to have that control group to see exactly if there is a difference between colds or amount of colds from people going to a gym or not going to a gym. In another example, a botanist is studying the effects of acidity on the growth rate of plants. So she grows one group of plant using water with neutral pH, and she grows each other group using water with increasingly acidic pH levels. So this would be an experimental study. It would be experimental because we have a control group, which was the neutral pH, And then we have another group where we are changing the variable, where we are increasing our acidity and trying to observe or try to see what happens as we change that. If we wanted to change this to an observational, we would do something where we use different sources of water, which would have a different pH, and observe. So similar style, except when we are doing observational, we are not controlling specifically what the variables are. We are still changing the variables, but we are not specifically controlling what they are. So there is a slight difference. So from our different studies and our different samples and so on, everything that we've looked at, we can collect two types of data. We can collect primary data, data that you collect yourself, or you could have secondary data where you use someone else's data and you make inferences and conclusions from that. Right? So what you might, or a big reason for this, or a big thing is, you might look at Stats Canada, you look at the general census that we've talked about in the past, right? Because one, secondary data might be easier to use because you can have like large corporations, large groups, the government can or has the means to collect all this data, and then you can use that to make your inferences. A general type or a general way to collect data, however, is in a survey. So there are certain questions or certain styles when answering or creating surveys. So the first type, open-ended, basically the respondents or the people answering the survey answer in great detail in their own words. Right? So it could be an open-ended question where there's no right or wrong answer. So something like, say, what is your opinion about, and so on, right? Or how do you feel about, right? How do you feel about MSIP, right? Or how do you feel about having snow days or having a midterm, something like that, something where there's no right or wrong answer and you're allowed to put down whatever your own thoughts are. Now, while these questions can give you great detail about the topic or about the person's opinion or thoughts, they are hard to measure. Right? They are hard to measure because they are all different. They may not answer them in the same way. So it's hard to kind of create a measurement from that. And as well, it is time consuming. If you do want to create a measurement from this, you would have to go in and somehow quantify your data because it's all opinion based and it's not an answer, a specific answer. You would have to come up with some way to quantify their results. And that means reading through everyone's answer, which can be time consuming depending on how people answer. The other type of question or the type of surveys questions would be closed questions. So these are different because there are limited ways to answer, right? So this means the respondent or the person doing the survey has only certain ways to answer. So this could be something like multiple choice, right? You have option A, B, C, or D. Sometimes you may give them the other option, which means something that's not included. You could have something where it is yes or no. Do you like math? Yes or no? It's a closed question. There's no maybe. There's no, well, I like it in this aspect and not in this aspect, and so on. We have true, false. We have a rating system, right? Or a scale. on a scale of 1 to 10. How do you feel? You can have something where it is check all that apply, because you're limited to those options. While you can still put multiple options, you're still limited to whatever the creator of the survey comes up with. In addition to those two types, you have different survey types for questions. So you have something where there is information. So this could be something like circle the appropriate response for gender and age, right? So you're getting information about the people. You have something where there is a checklist, right? Check all the sports you play. Ranking, rank the following in order of importance. How important is this to you? And so on. And a rating, seen this, rate how satisfied you are with the service, right? That's another example. So there are different types of questions in open and closed, and how you can word them. So with surveys, there are characteristics of good survey questions. You want to make sure that they're simple, specific, relevant, readable, or legible, and in logical order, right? You don't want to have questions jumping over the place. You want to make sure that the questions make sense when you're reading them. You want to make sure that it's specific, it's simple, and it's relevant to what you're looking for. All options are available in closed questions. So if you had a multiple choice question or a check all question, you want to make sure that all those options are available, or all the options you can think of are available to the respondent. So you want to keep that, because that is important, but keep in mind you can have the other category, because it's obviously you're not going to be able to write down every single option, so you may have to put down an other option. No jargon, so basically again making sure that it's simple and readable. You want to make sure that you're not putting words in that others may not know, or if you are and it's like key terms, you want to make sure that they understand what they are. No abbreviations. So again, you want to make sure that people understand what they are answering, what they're reading, and so on. No negatives. So you don't want to include kind of negatives in your questions. You don't want to try to persuade the respondent to respond in a certain way. And that kind of goes into the next one, where you are trying to avoid bias and insensitivity. So you want to make your questions general. You want to get the respondents' true beliefs, true opinion, without trying to sway them in a certain way, because that can cause some questioning in the validity of your survey. You want to keep all your responses confidential. That doesn't mean that you are not going to use the data or publish it in a general sense, but each person's individual data is going to be confidential. So that means you're not going to know who responded in which way. So again, this is important to know, because that's the key thing about surveys. You want people to feel comfortable opening up and answering. You do not want to make them change their response based on if they're going to be seen or not. And no changes to font, highlight, or bold. You want to keep it neutral. You don't want to draw people's attention to a specific spot in the question or a specific word, because again, that can cause questions of validity. So again, this note was just focusing on the different types of survey questions you could have, and some of the characteristics of a good survey question.